Hi everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to a very unique episode of From the Bench, where I'm here live with Jens Jungkurth. Jens is a... Oh, I better turn the sound off on this. Thank you. So Jens had a company called Eisen Audio. He designed the TM79 and AWB95 color modules. He's done a bunch of design work for us, and I had him in the office today to talk about Neve stuff, because I'm curious about that, and I know very little about it. So I thought it would be awesome to have Jens here to just answer questions and talk about stuff.
Why not?
Yeah, Jens has repaired a bunch of consoles, designed a bunch of gear, so please feel free to hit us up with your questions about analog gear and consoles and DIY and everything. We're going to start with one that was submitted to us on Instagram. It was... Oh, shoot. I don't have it in front of me.
Oh, it was someone who had the DOA color module for the color series, and had tried a number of different discrete op-amps and couldn't hear much of a difference.
That's
wondering why.
Yes, and Jens is a great person to answer this question because Jens actually designed the DOA color module for us. So I'll do the zoom out. I'll just explain what that is. So in the DOA color, that's just a way to get the sound of any discrete op-amp you want in your color module or in your signal path. Discrete op-amps are basically self-contained amplifiers that have been designed by audio companies over the years to do very audio-specific jobs. The most famous of which is the API 2520, which since API's inception almost to this day has been like at the heart of their gear and their sound. And then there are others like the Jensen / John Hardy 990 and the Melcore 1731. So yeah, Jens's module was a way to plug any of those that you wanted into the color format to get their sound. And so what's going on? Why can't this customer hear the difference between the modules?
Well, even though those op-amps all share the same pinout, they don't all get used or compensated or perform exactly the same way in context. Normally you'd see different support components, feedback, etc., depending on the amplifier design. And so in order to make a circuit that would accept any amplifier we could think of and have it bias up and operate, we had to make the circuit really dumb.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's not going to oscillate, it's going to pass signal linearly. And it turns out that most op-amps designed for that format are designed well. They perform well. They have tons of open loop gain, usually on the order of 90 decibels.
Okay.
And in our configuration, again, settling on something that would always work, I believe we've got about 20 decibels of gain and attenuation before it.
Yeah, that's
and so the amplifier uses the rest of its feedback to achieve that and linearize its performance. And so if it's a good amplifier and you're feeding it from a well-conditioned buffered source, it's just resistors in, resistors out, there's nothing particularly challenging or nonlinear going on.
Right.
The amplifier doesn't have to work that hard, and you've got a nominal line level, so it's not exaggerated, it's subtle.
Right.
You can put a really crappy amp in there, and by some regards crappy, and hear more color, but most of them, unless they're broken, you're not going to hear much until you turn up the drive and overdrive it.
Right. And
then you should hear obvious differences depending on how much distortion. Whereas, in the original applications, like a console summing amp or a mic preamp, where there are transformers interfacing and the amplifiers asked to provide a lot more gain, less linearizing feedback, and most importantly, many cascading stages. There, you'd expect to hear a more obvious sonic footprint. It's very subtle in the DOA color module because it's just one stage, not working very hard, presented with a signal that doesn't need a lot of gain. So,
yeah, that makes sense, and that's kind of points to a larger point with anything saturation and coloration related, which is that one stage is just not very much. Like we've been talking about console designs and topology all day, and I've thought about this dozens of times, but every time it kind of hits me again that when you were tracking through a console, you maybe would be hitting 7 transformers and just different amp stages, and
by the end of the record,
so one stage, maybe if you had 7 color DOAs in series with different op-amps,
stepping up, stepping down, combining, driving transformers, receiving transformers, etc. Absolutely.
And it was an interesting. It reminds me of designing that. It was an interesting design challenge to have to balance. We wanted to make it work as hard as possible, so we gave it this really low impedance load to drive, and we gave it a cap in the feedback path to slow it down.
And inserted a resistor in series of the cap it was driving, and made the resistors as low as we could. So,
but if we gone too far, you couldn't just drop any DOA in there.
We had to make the amplifier work hard, but while still having foolproof support circuitry.
So I'm not sure how to check the chat here. Is there anything in the Instagram chat?
Pardon me, off screen here. Don't see any questions yet.
Okay, cool.
Oh, hi, Sam. Sam Perez says hi.
I have a question over here as well.
Oh, cool.
All right. Chris has a question for us.
No. This is from Lullabies in the YouTube chat. He says, what's next for Eisen Audio and DIY RE collaboration?
That there's perhaps something was beginning today, but Jens over the past couple years has taken a step back from the design game.
Guilty as charged.
To do cool stuff like recording bands, but do you think there's ever a chance you would be drawing circuits again?
Well, yeah. In my so-called spare time, I'm still working on custom console projects.
Oh, that's right.
But I do, full disclosure, I mostly am a freelance recording engineer these days, and Eisen Audio is unofficially idled. So
are you?
So I'm not doing design for hire like I did.
Right. Are you at liberty to talk about your console projects at all?
It's just I mean, over the years, my main interest was always circuit design, product design. Like, how do we make great analog processors that make music sound better? And my primary education for learning how to do that was servicing, upgrading, modifying, rebuilding, etc., vintage analog equipment around New York City. And I studied under and worked alongside older techs who'd been doing it quite a lot longer, and so sharing a shop, shooting the shit, it would just always come up. Well, every console sucks, and here's why.
Right.
And how would we do it? And then you get some, if you're so lucky, you get some clients who share that insight, who have the experience and owned a bunch of consoles, and it's like, well, if I ever get the money, I'll just have you guys build one. And foolishly, we've accepted a few times, and so I guess we've got my closest colleagues and I, namely John Klett. We've got 2 or 3 projects that we need to be trying to finish later this summer. So if I'm not doing sessions, I'm going to be doing that, and if I had the time and the budget, I'd like to be sitting around designing more colors and more EQs and whatnot. But
cool.
That's not where life has taken me lately.
Yeah.
So,
what does it cost to make a one-off custom console?
It basically costs. I'm fond of saying it tends to cost just as much money to make one of something as it does to develop it as a product you can repeat.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons I try not to get suckered into custom work.
Right.
You think, oh well, we could do this for $50,000, sure, but ends up being closer to $100,000 for a large format console.
Okay.
And then you end up spending all of that on time and on botched prototypes and whatnot.
I see.
And then you need somebody to come along and buy essentially the same console another 2 times.
Right.
On the third one, you might make money.
Gotcha. So it's one of those classic agreements where nobody's happy by the end.
Yeah, and I mean, it really depends. If you don't want that many channels and you don't want the channels to do all that much and you don't want to pay yourself all that much, sure. I mean, as the DIY community knows,
right,
you can build something very cheaply, even a whole console. But if you are, say, replacing a Neve console and you want something comparable,
right,
in terms of longevity, build quality, sound quality, topology,
right,
you're going to spend approximately what those consoles cost when they were new, minus profit if you're not profiting, and minus the amortization of repeat. So
right, yeah.
So it's
interesting. I can't tell you. Probably a couple times a year, I get an email from a very motivated person who's like, I just got into this DIY thing. I built some stuff. It's amazing. My next project is a custom console, and I never want to be discouraging, of course. I never want to be like, forget it. But I certainly have received much fewer emails being like, okay, the console's done. Here are the photos.
Yeah. And I'm guilty of that.
Yeah.
Once upon a time.
Of wanting to do a custom console?
Yeah, just discovering this world and being like, oh, this is great. I'm gonna build everything in my studio.
Right.
And yeah.
Well, you went even one step further. I mean, and we're like, I'm gonna do a 10-year detour into running an audio company.
Yeah, because
so we're really a step above the insane console people in the insanity.
And it was a detour, and it was an accident too. Absolutely, yeah. It's just if you want to get really deeply into something like that, it ends up taking all your time. And if you're spending all your time on it and you're not independently wealthy, then you have to make it your job. And now your back's up against the wall to run your little company, and and I guess that's all I do now is I do that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's for sure. Chris, just let us know if there are any more questions.
We have a question from Jay Pakashi.
Okay.
For Jens, any cool gear you've made for yourself that you're using in your recording projects?
I'm
just going to rephrase the question just in case it didn't make it to the mic. You're monitoring. Can you hear yourself on that?
That's a good question. I sound far away.
Okay. The question was, has Jens made any cool gear that he uses on his own projects now that he's an audio engineer?
Yes, I have a manufacturing brand with John Klett called Nonlinear Audio, all one word. And we have a 500 series filter module called the Curvomatic FT501, and it's a sweepable high pass and low pass with variable resonance at the cutoff. And there's also a Baxandall tone control in there. And I use those filters a lot. I have 4 of them in the studio I work at most of the time, and I really love the old passive filters like Pultec HLF3C or an AwTac 9670, and I love to remove the 600 ohm termination resistor and put a damping pot on there, so that if you have the output, it's a passive filter. If you have the output going into a bridging load, then they'll ring. You'll get several dB of free gain resonance at the cutoff, and that can be really cool. So simulating that actively in the Curve-O-Matic module, there's the frequency is on a knob and the resonance is on a knob. So
cool.
It's not just click, click, click. It's, find exactly where, the fundamental of a kick drum lives and boost it and high pass everything below that. Or, same thing in the high end. Find, where's that, meaty part of a hi-hat? Let's low pass and get rid of the air and then just bring out that attack, for example. So I like those filters that John Klett and I came up with, and
I remember a few years ago, not to interrupt, but there was like this cool box you made called the Bump Box that was like a really high-end consumer level to stereo professional. Do you ever use that?
Yeah, I forgot about that. I use that every day. That's what people plug their phones into when they come in. And it's just a pair of, a set of IC buffer amps driving a set of Jensen transformers just to get a balanced line level out on the patch bay from your mini jack.
Yeah.
And
cool.
That was a real loss and a pain to build.
As a product,
so I'm not building them.
Yeah.
We just did like one handmade batch for clients who wouldn't leave me alone.
Right.
And kept one. Love it. Also ended up using it on the output of a reverb. The Fisher space expander. So it's
just
spring reverb, and it's meant to go in the high impedance effects loop of a tube hi-fi. The outputs are plates, 12AX7 plates. So they can't drive jack shit. They need to be buffered.
Gotcha.
But they're already at very high level, up to plus 30 dBu. So you don't need any gain. So you can't. So what do you do with an output like that? That you don't need a DI.
Right.
And most things aren't high impedance enough. So I just modified a bump box to buffer that, and now everybody who knows about it is asking for one. And it's just, I don't want to build anymore.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Cool. Chris, we got any?
There's another. And Jay says, "Cool, thanks. I'll have to check those out."
Oh, here's the chat. I see it.
Did you get chat? Do one from Instagram, and we'll come back to YouTube.
Okay. Do we have any from Instagram? I'm seeing the chat on YouTube now.
The pop.
I'll get back to that one, and then let's see.
K.E.C. Jackson asks, have you ever thought of making a 500 series chassis that's more than 2 slots?
I have definitely, yes. And I have talked to some people about working on it, and yes, so I've definitely thought about it. It's not in the next 3 or 4 products that we would be working on. So yes, definitely someday, but not. It's not in the definitely not this year. So Pop Polize says, thanks for answering my DOA question. However, I still don't quite understand. Am I not driving the DOA quite hard into saturation when I apply 100% of the color? Shouldn't I hear the differences then? And Lullabies replied, try the Red 25 in the DOA. I like it on bass in particular, and it gets quite gritty. Yeah. So, I think they all get gritty.
It would depend on the energy in your program material. Yeah, if the signal's not loud enough, if it doesn't have low end, if you're not clipping, you're not going to hear clipping, and if it's not a
well, I think what he's saying is he's hearing clipping, or they're hearing clipping, but that it's not it's hard to distinguish one DOA from the other,
Right.
even when they're clipping.
Right.
And
Well,
correct me if
yeah.
I'm wrong on that.
If you're hitting the rails and it's the same decoupling, same feedback, and similar design topology, similar modern transistors, etc., then sure, it'd be a very similar kind of distortion.
Yeah, I have to say, and I forget, I'm sorry, exactly which ones you said, Pop, that you had used, but when I've auditioned them, the one that to me is the most distinctive is the 1731. That one sounds it just gets grittier earlier. It just sounds very different from all the others. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, the 990, to me, it's cleaner, longer, but then when it clips in a pretty nasty way.
Yeah.
But it's hard without hearing what you're hearing to know exactly. But yeah, I think what Jens is saying.
I would say also it's not always about distortion and making things dirtier. When I used to make a 500 series preamp kit as Eisen Audio, and that was I tried every DOA in that format I could find, and the game was just pair a DOA with a set of transformers to make a microphone preamp that has that sounds different than the next. Sounds like whatever you want. And I kept coming back to the Purple Audio KDJ4 discrete op-amp because although relatively transparent like 990, I found that it sounded a lot smoother, softer, more euphonic. Just doing a clean gain, just passing through the signal. It's just like, well, it's hard to explain why, but things sound a little bit smoother now. I like it better. It's more relaxed. It's there was some accumulation, very subtle, not exaggerated, that I found useful.
Right.
And so I would reach for that a lot. That's a color.
Right.
It's one of the frustrating things sometimes about analog pro audio is these aren't guitar pedals for microphones. They're subtle accumulations that stack up in your mix.
Right. And that would be a cool experiment, Pop. Like if you wanted to run, say you had an 8-channel mix, run all 8 of them separately through that DOA and then compare with different DOAs and then compare those mixes to each other. I'd be really interested to hear whether you could hear more of a difference then with those effects stacking across multiple tracks or not. So Ali asks, Jens, what color are your pants?
Purple.
It's more complicated than that.
You're just like a...
You're going to see me later.
How much does Purple Audio pay you to keep you on retainer, to be standing there DOAs and wearing their pants all the time?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot the full disclosure. One of my first jobs was at Purple Audio doing assembly and repair and recap and whatnot. And that evolved into doing design consulting, which I still do occasionally. And the pay cannot be disclosed, but there's no retainer. It's just Andrew Roberts is a hell of a guy. I want to help him out, and he makes sure I'm taken care of for that.
And be honest, were the pants comped like by Purple or?
No, Purple Audio helped my love of Purple the color.
Oh, really?
Over the years, and so I guess I subconsciously ended up with purple pants. It hadn't occurred to me that there's a connection.
Yeah. Cool. Oh no, the asshole box is visible.
No!
So there's a question about that. Sorry, we can't disclose what's in the asshole box.
I'm not sure it is visible.
It's visible in the Instagram feed. I believe it's short for Assembled Colors Box.
Makes sense.
But I've never looked in there.
There's some missing.
I wouldn't that way on purpose. Stay on the box.
Cody Tillett asks, do you know anything about mixer blocks by Fine Gear? I know a little bit. Jens, have you heard about them
No.
at all? It's
Never heard of it.
It's a really cool concept. It's a modular mixing board where they sell channel strips and they sell a bus section, and they snap together. And I believe, I'm probably going to mess up some details here, but I believe they're based on the That Corp preamp chips for the preamp section. They have you can, and I believe even the channels are modular. You can have like a fader or an EQ section.
Oh wow.
And they have a color socket.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And what do you mean they snap together?
The front panels have this kind of interlocking. For each channel has this kind of interlocking,
Wow.
very clever design. So I haven't tried one personally. I've never seen them in person, but I've been in touch with them, and the website is extremely impressive. So that's all I know. I'm excited to try one out, maybe at AES or something.
Sounds great. Good look into that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's the mixer blocks by Fine Gear. MESH Mesh Audio asks, oh wait, that was the Ask Cole box. Master the Sound asks, re-release those gold Lil Peckers. I need a pair.
Can't be done. Now, that product was just an excuse to use up a pile of spare Neve transformers that we had accumulated at the shop back when people were throwing away Neve frames. And what do you do with all these other transformers that are in the frame that are not in modules? And so designed that EQ around those transformers until we ran out of them. And Anderson had to work really hard to figure out how to reissue that as a Purple Audio product. And I'm happy with it. It's done. It was meant to be a limited edition, and Neve transformers are unobtainium these days, as are the capacitors I used. So not going to happen.
And so that was your first product design, unless I'm wrong.
After the DIY kit, yeah.
Right. Okay.
That was the first assembled product, and then I was doing the
And that was an Eisen product?
Eisen Audio.
Okay.
Yeah. Eisen, I never really figured out how to have like a permanent product line. As Eisen Audio, it was just me alone initially, my corporate entity, and then we when I hired people, eventually it was to do manufacturing for brands I started with other people.
Right.
I never really figured out how to have a brand alone. So I was learning and experimenting, and the Lil Pecker was just an addition. Just try this, see what happens.
Right.
Then they were very well received, but it wasn't meant to be an ongoing product.
Right. Talk about breaking the first rule of product design, of like speccing an obsolete part. That's.
Well, it was all about using old parts.
I'm just teasing.
Because I shared a big repair shop with some guys who'd been there much longer than me, and we had lots of parts to use. So.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have. Jay asks, this is a great question for Jens. Does knowing and understanding what's going on inside gear affect recording engineering decisions?
Yes and no. I don't think it helps me get better sounds. When I trained as an engineer when I was much younger, and then I worked full time as a tech for 10 years. And when I first got back into engineering a few years ago, I had I would say I had a Goldilocks period where my just being able to look around the studio and just like see all the schematics, know all the components, know like the way there's a coupling capacitor in that one box that just does this thing that that'll be good on this snare drum right now. I was really in tune with the minutia, and that helped me, adjust sounds in cool and subtle ways. But I soon got over that just from working every day, and I don't think. I mean, it's great because I do mostly analog recording. It's great when the tape machine breaks or the console breaks. Right. I can stop and fix it.
Right.
And I love that. And I love knowing in my mind the complete signal flow at a component level when I'm patching, when I'm making decisions. But I do not think any of that helps me get better sounds or make better records. I'm constantly awed by my peers who know nothing technical.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I've seen you in the studio once, and you weren't even working technically.
I was just tape opping for somebody as a favor.
Budos band happening. But it did in that something happened with the tape machine, and in like 2 minutes you were like, oh, it's blah blah blah, and it was fixed, and like that session, kept going more smoothly because of that. There's no denying that.
Well, yeah.
But
and that was always my career goal, is just being a kid and reading books and reading about like Motown or someplace where they built their own gear, and they just it was all in house, and it was all in service of the song, and engineers knew what they were doing, and I wanted to be like that, and as much as I could. So it feels good, and it comes in handy, especially because analog recording is such a dying desert island these days.
Right.
So I feel that I have to be self-sufficient like that, and it's good. But I don't know that it helps me make better sounding records. That's just practice and listening.
Wasn't that the live record where you drove a tape machine down to Asheville?
That was for the Daptone record label.
Okay.
And they're known for they used to be known for analog tape purism. So we had to, as a matter of policy, drive a tape machine down to record the gig on it.
That's pretty wild. And
I was on the gig in case the tape machine broke.
Yeah, was it in okay shape once it got there?
That machine was fine. It was a Tascam. Those usually just work until they don't. But yeah, that's how I got back into doing recording full time. Is just being around the studio, waiting for something to break or waiting to help the engineer to producer in some funky situation, and then I say something and people realize, oh, he's got ears. Right. He's cool. All right. Oh, why don't you just do this? Yeah, why don't I just do this?
Nice. That's kind of like, I was going to comment earlier on the sales tactic of repairing consoles and just telling everybody, all consoles are shit. So if you ever need a good one, come to us, and then eventually.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. TM79 asks, hello. Hello to you. Do we have anything coming in from YouTube?
Yeah. What's the latest on the rack mount preamp? Asks Lullabies.
Oh, okay.
And another question from Lullabies, but let's do the first one.
Okay. So that is partially why Jens is here. Thanks for asking about the rack mount preamp. That was something a couple months ago I did a From the Bench about where I was considering doing a color, like a stereo CP5 color preamp in a rack mount box, which would indeed be very cool, and I solicited feature requests and stuff for that. The story up to now with that is I did a bunch of prototyping, a bunch of PCB layouts just to kind of get a sense of the scope of the project. And then somebody threw a total wrench in the mix by saying, like, what nobody has done is a Neve preamp in a rack mount box for DIY. And I don't know what's, so it brought me back to the drawing board a bit. So I've never designed a Neve preamp before. I've never really studied the Neve lore or the Neve circuitry. So I also hadn't seen Jens in a year. So I was like, I'll have Jens come down from New York and we'll talk about Neve stuff for a day. So that's why we're here. But yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with that, whether it'll just go back to being a color thing or whether that will be two different products or they'll be combined somehow. But that's the latest. That's where we are on that right now.
Mm-hmm.
So. Clarifying question from Catface. 1073 or 81?
Yeah, those are the questions that I'm probably 3 to 6 months out from even considering. Right now it's like questions like, is it feasible to make a reasonably awesome Neve style preamp that's an affordable DIY kit in a rack mount box? And what components am I going to have the hardest time sourcing? And what are going to be the really critical parts? And what are going to be the ones where we can look for alternatives? And so I'm thinking very big picture right now, and not part numbers yet. But good question. Should we get to Lullaby's second question?
It was Jens. What bands are you working with lately?
Not really supposed to talk about that because the records don't come out for a year typically. But I can say, very excited, very proud, very honored to be working on another album with Mr. Lee Fields. Lee Fields and the Expressions.
Awesome.
My personal favorite singer living today.
Wow.
So, yeah, we're working on that album, mixing over the next while, and we need some more vocals and horns. But that'll be out at some point on Big Crown Records. Mm-hmm. What else can I talk about? That's the question.
You could go years back.
I just want to, while you're thinking of that, put in a correction from Pop, which is completely correct. There was the Easy 1073 by AML, which is a rack mount kit preamp.
Oh yeah, okay.
And as far as I know, is still available. So thank you for that. I forgot that was an oversight. And Colin, also a console repair tech, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And certainly knows the Neve stuff.
And excellent parts supplier. Very grateful that he stocks that stuff.
Yeah, one of the few remaining sources for certain switches and transformers and stuff.
Faders.
Oh, and faders, yeah. Anyone else you're at liberty to discuss?
It depends on the time period. I mean, I lose track, and I can only remember what I did a week ago. And the thing I did a week ago won't be announced for months. So I can't divulge that. I can tell you something I helped out with over the last few years that's coming out this fall. It's a vocal group on the Daptone label called the Shala Das. Pretty excited about that. It's a father and his 3 grown sons from Staten Island singing doo-wop and early rock. And,
awesome. That sounds great.
It's going to be pretty fun.
With the kind of house band?
Yeah, with the Manahan Street Band, which is guys I work for a lot.
Cool. There was a request for Murph, and this is Murph. He's been very quiet, which is surprising. So, thanks, Murph. All right, back to bed.
Good boy.
All right, anything from Instagram here?
I appreciate the mystery.
Oh, that was about
the
Ask Cole box.
Yeah, I don't see anything more recent than that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Winding down over here. It seems like I could put out a.
This is for the folks on YouTube who didn't see. This is the box in question. I don't know if it's
Assembled colors.
yeah.
Not.
Yeah.
It's actually the box on there refers to what's inside the box.
Oh right,
It's
each
short for
box
boxes.
is 4 assembled.
Ah.
So
It's
they're
even-
all 3.
So all box is short for boxes.
Yes. It's even dumber than
That's right. It's assembled color boxes, not
Right.
assembled colors. Right.
We got another on the YouTube channel.
Cool. From Catface. Quick tech question.
Mm-hmm.
When you're protecting a FET with a Zener, does it go before the gate and after the source? Question mark.
Oh, you mean a Zener feedback, like a clamp?
I asked Catface.
Clamp? I'll just let the.
I'm not familiar with that protection method, to be honest. The source. I mean, a FET as a follower, you do something on the gate relative to the signal ground or relative to the rails, just to limit the swing. Source, I'm not draining the source. I'm not familiar with protecting that. That would just. I always just try to set up the FET in a way that it can't exceed its safe operating area. Pardon me. From a design standpoint and from a repair standpoint, I've never really done any preventative maintenance or hacks to save FETs.
There's no, not like a flyback.
Yeah.
That's typical housekeeping for a FET, right?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
It's usually to do with the how you constrain your rails.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I hope that was helpful. Catface. But so what is you have another big console project you're trying to wrap up next month. What is the hopefully where is that right now? Like what's the status of it?
We have a frame built, power supplies, router modules. We have a lot of circuits drawn, and we need to finish all the board layouts, finish all the interconnect. We've designed an EQ, but we need to assemble 64 of them, and
64 channels.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think it's good when you're doing design, especially like systems design, like a big project, to take a long time and you keep coming back to it and looking at, I'm a details person. I tend to always just be zoomed in and negating the rest, and it's you have to keep zooming out.
Right.
And that's I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of DIYers aren't making more consoles or more mixers is the systems are hard.
Right.
And so to do a big console system, it's good to just keep planning and thinking and sketching and just working it out conceptually for a good long while before you draw anything. Because it's in this case we're only making one. I can't do 3 rounds of prototyping. I just have to draw it once. So where we're at is we've had a good long while to do all that stuff, and now we've just it's just going to be hours drawing, hours stuffing, and then hopefully it all works.
Yeah.
So
how do you kind of break that up? I imagine you design a channel, and then you can stress test that, and then you can stress test like the bus section. But when it comes to like grounding and shielding the whole system, you have to get that right.
The power distribution, decoupling, summing nodes, experience. Just, as I said before, my education has mostly been going around servicing, modifying other consoles, and just, what did everybody else do? What has worked? And I imagine that's one of the reasons you see a lot of the same techniques repeated throughout a console, like the same little building blocks. Is just, this works. We know this works.
Right.
We only get to test it as a big giant thing when it's all put together. So we're gonna do what works. And then you never know. Sometimes you do. You get the thing fully loaded, and you're like, well, now the rails are motorboating. How do we solve that?
What is motorboating?
Low frequency oscillation turning on and off.
Gotcha. Low frequency AC oscillation
imposed on your power supply rails. Yeah.
Okay. Huh. Well, good luck. Yeah. There's no wood in this desk. Sorry.
Can I real quick ask a question?
Yeah.
Are you designing power supplies, or do you just go off the shelf?
The question was, when you're building a custom console, do they use off-the-shelf power supplies or design it from scratch? Right.
I think it's good to know about power supply design. It's a good thing to study and to try on a small scale, but once you realize what a pain in the ass it is, and you discover designs that have existed for 50 years that you really like, that are really reliable, that sound really good, then we just buy those off the shelf. I mean, mostly we're just using a Copian Gold Box A series.
Like linear, or do you have any feelings on the switching stuff?
I've tried a few of the switchers, and I don't want to endorse anybody, but yeah, some brands are terrible and will fail, and other brands are okay if you keep them loaded and filtered and ideally re-regulated. And so then the big challenge becomes, well, how do you direct all the noise that you're shunting and not have it contaminate your ground, contaminate everything? So
you stick with linear most of the time.
It depends. If the design, if I know it's all ICs and the power supply rejection ratio is incredible and everybody's sharing the same ground everywhere, it's a small area. I've got transformers to the outside world. In that case, I can get away with a switcher. But in a larger system where there's discrete circuits that have hardly any power supply rejection, and I'm not. It's not just a ground plane or a chassis or shield everywhere. Ground follows signal. Then I can only really tolerate switchers if they're used on separate utility rails and they're external and they're housed separately. Like relays, sure, we can have a switcher do that if it's good enough.
Yeah,
But no, I like the power ones and the Acopians, because very rarely do they fail, and they sound fine and they work. So usually just rack those up.
Yeah.
Cool. We have a couple more questions. We have, what is the vision for the 64-channel custom desk?
The vision is whatever its owner wants. The owner commissions.
Right.
We built.
Yeah. But surely the owner, I'm sure the owner is very knowledgeable, but surely...
Oh, you mean why is it 64 channels, for instance?
Well, I was thinking, do they specify okay, I want this preamp circuit, I want this EQ circuit?
Usually the specification is more I want, sure. I remember when I had this console, I really liked this style of equalizer, and what's that about, and how can we derive the essence of that? But I wish it did this other thing that this other console I had did, and it's just conceptually, yeah, sure. Everybody's always referencing their experience and existing things that they've used,
right?
But it's usually a series of concepts like that. I'd really love it if it sounded like this, but it did that, and copying things exactly is I try to shy away from. It's usually more about what are you into? What's the style? What's the ballpark?
Right.
What's the feature set? And why do you like that? Show me how you're using it. Let's do a session. Let's get a mix up and show me. Let me hear it. And and then deduce from there.
And then will you draw on kind of different archetypes of okay, I'm going to go for a Trident preamp section here and a Neve EQ followed by a API output section, or
not necessarily that specific, but sure, yeah, something like that.
Okay.
I want a sweep EQ, and I really like the way Trident did it on the TSM. And what made that special? Can we cop what made that special? But I really want it to operate this way. You know, I've used a bunch of different EQs. I know what kind of feature set I want.
Gotcha.
Like that.
Interesting. So have you ever taken something like where somebody says, "Oh, I want the Trident EQ or something," but you realize it discreetly, or like you realize their feature set that they want in a different kind of circuitry than the original that they were used to? Do you know what I mean?
I've done. That's really hard to do. It's really it's going from ICs to discrete. It ends up being overgrown and involved. A few people have done that well, but I haven't typically bothered. I'll do, I'll say, well, it really needs to be discrete here, like on a summing node. But if it's a unity gain follower and the operating level is low, I don't care.
Right.
And then I've taken designs that were passive or that were discrete, and then figured out ways of emulating them with ICs, because it's easier to go that way.
Right. I was thinking of your Flexi Guy preamp where you did a Trident-ish thing but with an IC.
Well, we used ICs on that because they were shitty, and we couldn't make them shitty in the same way discretely.
It's like it's hard to find transistors that are as shitty as the old ICs you used.
Like a really primitive IC op-amp design. They've got a limited amount of surface area. They're depositing all the passives and the transistors on the same die, and it's just the parasitics are crazy. And a discrete amp would be too good.
Right.
So
that's Nonlinear Audio's Flexi Guy preamp I was referring to just there.
You're plugging me.
I would just want to make sure people were following. It's available at
Etsy.
Chinese white man who had asked the previous question about the console clarified sonically, functionally. So I guess wondering if you can say any more about what was the vision that you were asked to realize about that or for that console.
It's unique to that user, what he likes to use.
So you're dodging again. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Because I don't think that's appropriate or relevant.
Right. Sure.
Everybody likes what they like.
Yeah. And you can't talk about it anyway. I feel like I'm like interviewing like there's this redacted and like interviewing the CIA director about
No, I was just being professional.
Okay, I know, I'm just kidding. But I won't have any more professionals on then, I guess.
When I DIY, it's for me.
Right.
When I do my jobs, it's for clients.
I'm just teasing you. Cool. We'll see. Let's see. It's 5:55. So if you have any more questions for me or Jens, shoot. But otherwise, I'll just keep asking Jens questions that I have.
Sure.
So one of the things we talked about this morning when we started talking about Neve stuff that I find is a really interesting discussion is like there was a demand for more Murph also.
Hi, Murph.
It was a demand from Murph.
This next question is from Murph.
But what's an interesting thing to think about is how the actual history and the lore of Neve have diverged. And can you say more about that? Like what you were starting to tell me this morning was really interesting about how well, I'll let you say it.
Well, So when somebody says Neve, I always ask, well, what do you mean? They've been making consoles since the late 60s. They still make consoles. The designs changed every few years. There's all kinds of Neve. And most people, for one reason or another, they're referring to the 80 series desks from the 70s, from about I don't know, 69, 70 until the end of that decade. Either the earlier Class A stuff or the Class 8B, like 80, 58 onwards. And then, you know, those were made in England, and so you might assume they were in all the cool little indie studios making classic rock records, and well, they weren't. They were broadcast desks built for clients with a lot of money, like the BBC, and the smaller studios were usually using something more obscure or building their own. And so, as far as I can tell from the sales history and just tracing what I can trace, you wouldn't find an 80 series Neve desk in most music recording studios until late 70s, you know, like 76 onwards.
And those would have been the Class A-B ones at that point?
Not necessarily, but predominantly.
Okay.
You can find isolated incidents, like you know, most people know now. Oh, Sound City got their Neve desk in, what was it, 73?
Okay.
But that was just one studio, and they were very lucky.
Right.
You were far more likely in London to find a Sound Techniques console in the late 60s and early 70s, for example.
Would the kind of the mid 70s on Neves that were actually a lot of records were made on?
Yeah.
Would those have had the same modules, like the 1073, 10? The famous.
It was
the famous channel strips.
It would be a version of that.
Okay.
The mic input transformer changed and the line input was remoted, but the EQ, the output, the insert send on that module would be the same. The gain stages were the same. The routers changed, the summing amps, the output amps, everything else changed.
So when did it become? I mean, that's an interesting story of kind of what are essentially these broadcast consoles have become kind of the gold standard for what a recording mic preamp and a recording EQ should look like.
Yeah. Well, they weren't always built for broadcast. They could be built for an opera house or a classical label, or they tended to be built for proper institutions with a lot of money who could afford them.
Okay.
And a lot of the, like, you know, for lack of a better term, classic or legendary like pop and rock and jazz records that people you know, just might assume were made on some awesome console like a Neve 8014 or whatever. They usually weren't. That's the issue.
Right.
But yeah, by the mid to late 70s, consoles were less likely to be a unique custom thing and far more likely just to be purchased from a big manufacturer who just made consoles.
Right.
And at that point, Neve already had a big presence, and they were making them so well that they just stayed. Just if you got an 8058 in 76, it might still be there today at a commercial studio in New York or LA.
Right.
And you think it was recapped on schedule, that has its switches cleaned and replaced, and so people just got used to seeing them. They became ubiquitous, and it was easy to imagine that it was always there.
Gotcha.
It's a classic thing, right? Like, oh yeah, like Fleetwood Mac used it. Like maybe did Led Zeppelin use one too? Right? They would have had the best.
Right. I see what you're saying. So it was like kind of this like reverse, like revisionist history.
That's the only way I can rationalize it. Yeah. I don't really know. I wasn't there.
Right. Cool. It looks like we have a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, no more on Instagram. Jay asks, coming from someone without any electronics knowledge, do we know why certain pieces sound the way they do? For example, API versus Neve. I get that they have different op-amps, transformers, etc., but do we know why certain combinations of electronics have a particular sound? I would answer that question in the positive. Like, yes, we do know, we can measure those things and see, like, okay, these create these harmonics, these create these different harmonics, these clip the signal in this way, these clip the signal in a different way. So I wouldn't say that the mystery is really in, do we know how they got those sounds? It's more in like, why is that sound so perennially appealing to us? But as far as, I think we're basically talking about pretty primitive circuitry here, pretty primitive, primitive circuitry causing very complex, very interrelated effects on audio, but that are still completely measurable and observable. Anything, thoughts on that?
I agree. The question is why.
Mm-hmm.
So, why? Well, or how? How did not how they did it, but how did they end up there? Why did they end up there?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not just the components. A lot of the differences. When I hear API versus Neve, I think consoles.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, a lot of the differences between parallel consoles, let's say from 1970, that you could compare from each company,
Mm-hmm.
is in the systems design, the different ways of controlling gain, the different ways of summing, where to attenuate and where to boost,
Mm-hmm.
How to combine, how to interface with the outside world.
Right.
That all accumulates, and then you feature set. What kind of controls did they give you, and how did that influence how you were utilizing all those stages, all those components?
Mm-hmm.
That to me is the sound of the brand, and a lot of it in terms of components is just incidental. It's what they could get, what influences and suppliers were available to them, and it's just like, well, we're just trying to make a good
Right.
functional thing. How do we
Yeah.
get there? Well, here's how we figured out how to get there today.
Right.
And it's incidental. And then to me, the reason we keep mentioning those two brands is because of ubiquity, market saturation.
Mm-hmm.
They both built a lot of consoles that stuck around in a lot of studios that people
Right.
just got used to thinking of as the benchmark.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I hope that went a ways to answering it. But thanks so much for everybody who tuned in on Instagram and YouTube. I'll see you next month for another live from the bench. And Jens, thank you so much. I really appreciate
My pleasure.
your time
Thanks.
and expertise.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Did it end automatically
Hold on.
at 6?
No, it did not.